Welcome back to another edition of the Stir Crazy podcast. As always, I am Rob Nelson.
And I'm Mike Bakov. And man, we like booze so much we're doing a second episode, huh?
Yeah, we are going to be filming the second segment in our series about Prohibition this week. We sat down with Carly Cremers from the Stuhr Museum educational staff, and then we headed out to chat with Dr. Phil Cahoy, a local surgeon in Grand Island, about his Prohibition memorabilia.
And he has a lot of memorabilia. I mean, he's got stuff that is very Grand Island specific, which I thought was very cool, and just lots and lots and lots and lots of advertising from pre-prohibition and maybe kind of in that gray area stuff as well. So it was a great conversation.
Yeah, I learned a lot about local brewing history. That's really where his interests lie, and mine as well. So even before we started on the podcast, we went down a few rabbit holes talking about these obscure breweries from around Nebraska that were flash in the pan enterprises, here one day, gone the next. And yeah, it was a really great conversation.
All right, so let's hops to it.
Oh God, here we go. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Stir Crazy podcast. As always, I am Rob Nelson. Today I'm joined with Carly Cremers, also from Stuhr Museum.
Hello.
Today we're going to continue our conversation on the history of Prohibition, and today we're going to kind of expand on our previous conversation from last week and kind of branch out into the national story, as it were, of Prohibition.
And it's a ride. I'm excited to be here on it.
Very, very fun stuff indeed. So why don't we jump right in and talk about temperance on a national scale at large? What was temperance? What did it look like?
It was a lot of things, and lots of people kind of narrow down the whole movement to when the amendment was passed and then retracted with another amendment. But it actually started way before that. So to start off with, I mean, alcohol was always a big part of America. Like, the Puritans brought a whole barrel of beer over. George Washington would give his men a glass of whiskey every day. But also, while taking that in and realizing that's not how we live today, because today we drink about 2 gallons of pure alcohol per year as an adult in America. And in the 19th century, that was 6 to 7 gallons of pure alcohol per year.
That's an American that drinks 2 gallons currently.
This year per year. And it used to be 6 to 7 in the 19th century. So not good, not healthy in retrospect, but also like these people didn't have soda. These people couldn't just like go and get orange juice or whatever. You pretty much had water or coffee or alcohol, and alcohol tended to often be safer than water.
Well, yeah, I was going to say the farther you go back, the more likely it is that you're drinking wine, that you're drinking some kind of beer. That's not, and when we say beer, it's not necessarily, your local 6-pack of Bud Light. Mm-hmm. There were variations that were highly not watered down isn't even the correct word, just had a low alcohol content that were grain based of some kind that are similar to beer, but weren't necessarily the product that we're necessarily talking about right now.
Yeah.
There's actually a famous, I don't know if it's true, there's a story that's, kind of become urban legend that the reason that the Mayflower stopped when it did is because that they were running out of beer and they needed a place to stop before they completely were out of their drinking supply, because that's the form of beer that they drank on their voyage was a very watered down, condensed form of like this grainy, low alcohol content substance. Mm-hmm. And they were running out of it. And that's why they chose to dock at Plymouth.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So it's just kind of that. I feel like it puts a lot of things into context where when we're realizing, yes, there was a lot of alcoholism back then, but also there's all these other factors. So throughout that time, it was actually women that started voicing a lot of concern about the amounts of alcohol these men were drinking, because this was back in the 19th century when a woman doing anything outside the house really wasn't allowed. So a woman wasn't out working. They were at home all day hanging out with the kids. And then at these various clubs and bars and saloons, you would have these men that would earn money and then go and get drunk. And oftentimes there was domestic violence there, and it just wasn't a great situation. So when you had these women that were wanting to stand up for themselves and realizing that, wow, we can protest? What? That was a whole new thing. And it was also pretty much in line with the suffragette movement. So it was a big turning point for women taking a stand and going out of this position they've always been pigeonholed in. And it was in 1873 to 74 that crusade started in Ohio, and they would march, they would pray in the streets, schools would close down because of these women praying in the streets, firefighters would hose them down. It was a lot. And then we have the good old Women's Temperance Union, formed in 1874, and there were so many different sections of this temperance union all over, where even in like Hastings, Nebraska, I know that there was one, and these people would make homes for inebriated women. They would also make water fountains in public parks, which were like, yeah, like that's something we see all the time. But I mean, for people back then to have public access to water and have something else to drink other than beer.
Exactly. It gets to that larger point. It's also, it becomes kind of a symbol of the movement itself. Like it kind of harkens to me of when I'm growing up in elementary school, seeing the red ribbons from the Mothers Against Drunk Driving.
Yeah.
It's kind of that's where your mind goes to it anyway.
Yeah. And they also wrote books and sang songs. And I actually, Rob, have some songs in front of me right here. Would you like to hear some?
I'd be disappointed if you didn't. Go ahead.
All right. Great. Thank you for asking. So there is the song of the Temperance Union, which, by the way, I know a lot of these songs because we'll get to her later with Carrie Nation. When I was in college at Hastings College, there was a professor named Jim Fritzler who compiled these different Temperance Union songs and the writings of Carrie A. Nation into a work called The Famous and Original Barroom Smasher. So I have professional collegiate experience with this music. So there's tons and tons of verses to the Temperance Union, but it kind of starts off with, we're coming, our brave little band. On the right side of temperance, we do take our stand. We don't use tobacco because we do think that the people who use it are likely to drink. Away, away, with rum by gum, with rum by gum, with rum by gum. Away, away, with rum by gum. The song of the Temperance Union. So quite catchy, right?
Yeah.
And then we just get deeper and deeper. So another verse is, we never eat cookies because they have yeast, and one little bite turns a man to a beast. Oh, can you imagine the utter disgrace of a man in a gutter with crumbs on his face? So we're starting to think, okay, that's a lot. And then there's another verse of, we never drink water, they put it in gin, and one little sip and a man starts to grin. Oh, can you imagine the sorrier sight than man drinking water and singing all night?
So they're against yeast and water
I don't
as
know.
well. I have not.
It gets to be a lot.
I've not come across that in my own research, but hey, I mean,
yeah,
temperance means anti a lot of things. So.
Yeah, you can find hundreds of verses because local temperance unions would also have their own verses based on what was going on around there. So, yeah, I don't know what options they really had because they never ate peaches because they ferment. They've really stretched it.
I'm sure that they're, kind of just making a point about what it is, but it's still,
I know. I just can't imagine
worth
seeing
mentioning.
one of these temperance union ladies on the street and saying, "You're drinking water. How dare you?"
Well, and you just said they put out drinking fountains,
right?
So I mean, yeah, it's hyperbole, but
exactly.
It's still really fun.
Yeah. So I feel like it's a fun little layered situation with Prohibition because it started out from a pretty feminist place, frankly, but then you had other people that went along with this and saying, yeah, this is something good because it often was because of religious purposes, especially Mormonism was a great one that kind of perpetuated a lot of this. And it got huge into politics where there was a man named Wayne Wheeler who he kind of honed in on this whole prohibition thing because with women, we also talked about how they were fighting for the right to vote, but they also were fighting for things like child labor laws and for immigrants. And they had all these issues on their plate that they were trying to knock down.
Sure.
But Wayne Wheeler was just going hard at the alcohol aspect, and he had a lot of political say because he would go to people and persuade them no matter what side they were on to be against alcohol. So, for example, he would go to workers in a factory and say, alcohol is what the man is doing to sedate you and keep you down and want you to work all the time, blah, blah, blah. And then he would go to the owners of the factory and say, alcohol is what's making your workers lazy and want to party all the time and not want to work. So then these two people were like, yeah. So he also just had a lot of pressure in politics and would get people kicked out if they didn't agree with him. So he was a powerful little old man. But
well, there was somebody else who I know you're really jonesing to talk about. who held a lot of sway and has become a face of this period in time. And that person is, of course,
Carrie A. Nation.
Yes.
Okay.
So yeah, let's jump in and talk about her a little bit. That's not her Christian name, as they say, is it?
Her name, I believe, always was Carrie, but it was originally spelled Carrie, and then she changed it to Carry, and she eventually married a person whose last name was Nation, so her name was Carrie A. Nation, and she was feared. Like, a little quick background on her life is she was born in Kentucky, and then she moved to Missouri, and she was converted to Christianity, and she married a doctor who turned out to be an alcoholic, and then she got pregnant and left him, and then in 6 months, she got a telegram saying that he was dead, presumably from alcohol reasons. So then she married Mr. Nation, who ended up being awesome for her name, and they also ended up in Texas, where he wrote in a newspaper negatively about the men who drink alcohol excessively, and he almost got beaten to death because of that. So she's had a lot going on in her life that's made her be like, alcohol isn't great. So then they moved to Kansas, and she got some movement with the mayor to start closing down places. And she had a dream where God was telling her, this is your mission. You are to go and keep closing down bars. And she said, yes, sir, I will go do that. In 1900s is when she took a bag where she literally filled it with bricks and then started going to places and destroying them. And she went to jail a lot. This is an excerpt from what she wrote in a book later about her life. And she said, now here is a list of the times and places I have been in jail. In Wichita, 3 times. Topeka, 7 times. Once 30 days, twice each 18 days, then 12 days. 15 days, 7 days, and 3 days. Kansas City once, part of a day. Also once part of a day at Coney Island. Once at Los Angeles. Once at San Francisco. Scranton, twice. 1 night and part of 2 days. Bayonne, New Jersey, a day and a night. Pittsburgh, 3 times, 1 night and part of 2 days. Philadelphia, once, 1 night. And on one of those nights in jail, Mr. Nation brought suit for divorce against me. So it's just so funny to me that she was just causing so much havoc. And she eventually got a hatchet. I don't know if I mentioned that, but she would be swinging a hatchet in bars.
She eventually got a hatchet.
Yeah, so I feel like there was a little scary, violent aspect there. But I don't know if it was just because she was a, God-fearing woman that these officers would jail her up and then say, all right, you're fine to go now.
There's actually, I know that there's a hatchet in the Smithsonian National American History Museum that I think that she used or was familiar with using anyway, but it says all nations welcome but Carrie. It's just etched in on this hatchet. And I have a picture of it I'm looking at in front of me, but yeah, I think it's really cool. I feel bad for her that she didn't actually get to live to see the fruition of all her efforts. I mean, that is a martyr for her cause. And whether you agree with it or not, she devoted her life to this one issue, and she dies in 1911 before it's actually, before it becomes part of the national constitution.
Yeah. It's
although, like, as you said, a lot of those instances took place in Kansas, which was the first state to become a dry state in, I believe, 1880.
Yeah.
If memory serves. So at least she did see some fruits of her labors.
Exactly. And I feel like she was probably just that figure during Prohibition that all these women that were just so scared to do anything probably really inspired them, where if this one lady is literally going with a hatchet and breaking down bars, then maybe I can go to a protest, or maybe I can say something to my husband. So even though it was very extreme and not the most peaceful method of protesting, I think it probably helped with the movement as far as gaining that momentum with women.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's not just alcohol. There's all sorts of things that they brought a lot of, or shed a lot of light on, like child labor laws began in the early 20th century, largely as a result of some of those efforts by those social organizations, temperance movements, etc. While the Prohibition Amendment might only have been around for 13 years, and it goes by the sun, their efforts are still felt with us today in other ways because of those sorts of things. Mm-hmm. And these social reformers, did a lot more than maybe they even realized, because we are still today living with the impact of the Prohibition years. Mixed drinks are a thing that come to mind, that originate during this time.
Yes, definitely. Mixed drinks is something that culturally with drinking we all are aware of. But I mean, before that, it was very much beer, wine, or just drinking things plain. But because of the methods that they had to use during Prohibition to get alcohol, as you talked about last time, they had to be sneaky. One of my favorite sneaky methods is Vine Glow. Have you ever heard of that product?
Yeah, vaguely.
It is a brick of dehydrated grapes where there was a warning label on it where it said, "Warning, after dissolving the brick in a gallon of water, do not place the liquid in a jug away in the cupboard for 20 days because then it would turn into wine."
Yeah, don't.
Yeah, right? But so that was
with a Catherine Hahn wink
right?
emoji.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the ways of getting alcohol wasn't always that hilariously easy. So the primary source of drinking alcohol was watering down industrial alcohol. So 3 gallons of faux gin or whiskey could be made from 1 gallon of industrial ink, that kind of thing. So it didn't taste great. And these moonshiners, a lot of times they never really barrel aged things. So they would go different routes to get that flavor. For example, the taste of bourbon was simulated by adding, any guesses?
I couldn't say.
Dead rats and rotten meat.
Wouldn't have gone there.
Nope, I don't think any of us would have. So, thinking of that, you probably wouldn't really want your whiskey on the rocks. And they knew it didn't taste great, and they would try to cover that up with as many sugary ingredients as possible. So that was also when Coca-Cola became a huge thing because, hey, they were producing something non-alcoholic, but hey, that also covers up the taste of our gross alcohol. So it also kind of affected how bars were designed. I mean, we all still love a good dark lounge that has these nice mixed drinks, or there are even some speakeasies today where
they play on that theme. Like that's the whole concept of their establishment is they are a speakeasy, and there's a door that is also a bookcase, and they have drinks that are called like Al Capone's Closet or something. That's completely over the top, but it's fun and people really like it.
Yeah, and I mean, women didn't really drink before Prohibition, but because everyone was trying to drink in a sneaky way during Prohibition, it was kind of like these exclusive parties that everyone was welcome to come to. So women would be there, people of different racial ethnicities would be there. It was kind of started getting everyone together over alcohol while a time when no one was supposed to be drinking alcohol.
Well, you raise a couple of good points, and they're kind of not related, but I'll try to hit both of them. What I would say to my favorite place that people stash alcohol is actually in the barber industry. I came across a story where, there were exceptions still for how people could get alcohol. Doctors were allowed to prescribe up to 1 pint of alcohol, I think, for 10 days. But also, barbers, they have implements that they use on people, like razors, like scissors, those sorts of things. And they put them in a barbicide glass bottle, which is a disinfectant alcohol bottle. So, one of these ways that alcohol became hidden in plain sight were through these barbicide canisters. And there would be, barbers would make these over the top large orders of barbicide in quotation marks, but really it would be some form of bootlegged alcohol, and they would hide it in plain sight on their own, on their own counters in their barbershop, and it would just be like, "Hey, look, nothing to see here. It's just my combs."
Yeah, exactly.
And, so I mean, there were raids over things like that. I mean, people just came up with all sorts of things.
Yeah, and I mean, the government started getting smart where they started realizing, people are using these industrial alcohols, so they added more toxins to it to try to make people sick from using it. So then these people had to come up with neutralizers, which then made the alcohol taste worse. And it was all just this big cat and mouse game. And
it wasn't healthy. I mean, the stuff you're talking about, I mean, that's what leads to bathtub gin. It killed people. It left people permanently paralyzed. And everything that it sought to accomplish, there were 100 other negative drawbacks to it.
And I mean, there was more drunk driving, more people dying from liver cirrhosis. And the thing that they were trying to get rid of people excessively drinking was happening more. And I think it's a big testament to how when you try to put in something and make it so it's totally illegal, there's no regulation on it. And if they did have solid regulation on it, they needed lots of people. But these people that were morally conservative also tended to be fiscally conservative. So they didn't want to put in the manpower and paying these people to make this really all-encompassing law stick. And then you have people just thinking, oh, well, it's illegal, winky face, but I'm doing it anyway. So then they start to lose regard for the law in other ways. So then you get mobsters and people just more willing to break any law because it's just chaos.
Well, and it was a top-down problem, too. I mean, there's a famous story about Warren G. Harding, president at the time, right when Prohibition takes place in 1921. He's hosting gambling nights at the White House, and he has a secret stash of alcohol that he keeps in the White House. So, I mean,
yeah,
how much,
There was a Republican governor that one time had a media crew come, and then he got a pint of beer, and he hollered over to a police officer and said, "Hey, are you going to arrest me?" And the police officer said, "No." And he just drank it. And it's all these pictures of him breaking the law and a police officer not caring.
Well, and you touched on a good point, though, about like the implementation of just how large, of an order this would have been. Like, yes, there's a law passed. Oh, great. Okay, now enforce it. That old Andrew Jackson line, he has his law now, let him enforce it. It's not about Cherokee removal at all, people. Yeah. This is not what this episode's about.
Nope.
But like there were, at the time of Prohibition, roughly about 1,300 breweries in America. 1,300.
Wow.
Like that's crazy to me. There, I mean, you can see the FBI, if you look this up, the FBI seized 697,000 stills making moonshine whiskey between just 1921 and 1925.
Jeepers.
Also, just in 1928 and 1929, the years leading up to the Great Depression, 1.1 million gallons of alcohol were seized by the federal government in pursuance of this. And that's just what they found, like that's just who they caught. That it was twice, 3 times, 10 times that was under the table that was never seized or found out.
People weren't really paying attention to it. I mean, President Hoover, they just kept saying, do something. And he's like, nah. But then after the Valentine's Day massacre with Al Capone's men just straight up murdering men against a wall, that was when people were really kind of saying, okay, this has gotten out of hand. Even the mobsters who have always broken the law, like they're crossing new lines now. We don't like this.
Yeah, I don't think that he was in favor of repealing Prohibition. I know that he campaigned against it. Mm-hmm. I think he ran against Al Smith in 1928, and Al Smith, who was the former governor of New York, if my memory is correct, was famously wet, Herbert Hoover famously dry, and Herbert Hoover almost unanimously ousted from office in 1932, and FDR brings back the alcohol as soon as he's able to in 1933 when he's sworn in.
Yeah.
We needed to do something because what we were pursuing was not working during those 13 years. But I'm still amazed that and I'd like to pause and just say that it's an amazing turn of events that we went from ratifying that amendment by constitutional provision and then less than 20 years later, just 13 years later, the exact opposite taking place and giving alcohol back to the people. Like there has never before or since been such a thing that has happened in terms of national legislation.
Yeah, I think it did not turn out at all what people wanted it to be. And there were a lot of people that knew pretty quickly that it was a mistake. And I mean, it caused a lot of cultural shifts for better or for worse. Lessons were learned, mixed drinks were created. I mean, it's contributed to the alcohol culture we have now, where it would have probably still been very beer and wine heavy, more so than it is today. If Prohibition had not happened, bar culture might be very different in general. It's one of those things where we'll never know, but it's fun to imagine sociologically how different things would have been without it.
I think that's a good place to hit pause. We will be back after these words with the next segment of the Sir Crazy podcast, so hang with us.
Today's podcast is brought to you by Travelers Home Boarding House. For boarding and lodging by the day or the week, see Miss Schoenfeld at the Travelers Home, located just south of Elfman's Barbershop on Front Street. Bathing room available for the ladies. Hot meals offered to lodgers on a nightly basis. Come, stay, and enjoy your time in Railroad Town.
And welcome back to the Stir Crazy podcast. I'm here with Dr. Phil Cahoy of Grand Island, and today we're going to be talking all things Prohibition. Thank you for being on the podcast.
No problem.
So let's kind of jump right in. I know you have an association with, Prairie Pride Brewing here in Grand Island. Did you start out home brewing, or how'd you get into the interest of beer?
Well, it all started several years ago. Back in college, a bunch of my friends from college, we would go out to western Nebraska and go hunt in Lisco, Nebraska, and we'd stay at the Stuhr's hunting lodge. And back then, there were a couple old signs in the hunting lodge back then. And being from Omaha, I looked into the history of stores and brewing throughout Nebraska, got interested in collecting memorabilia from the old pre-prohibition Nebraska breweries like Grand Island and Hastings, Columbus, all over the place. Started collecting those things. Then it just kind of progressed into saying, at the time, microbreweries were starting to get big. And I said, Grand Island does not have a microbrewery. I know most microbreweries were in places where there were colleges, younger people,
sure,
a little more open minds, and Grand Island didn't have one. And I thought, probably wouldn't be a bad idea to maybe start one. And it took about 4 or 5 years before we could get enough people together that really were interested in starting it. And that's just kind of how it came about.
That building that's down there in downtown Grand Island, I know it was a few things before it ended up being a brewery. Do you know what it happened to be before it was that?
I think it was at one time a plumbing implement building, and the floors are 12 inches of concrete, and I think they used to drive some older truck lifts on that. And I think it was a tannery at one time too, I believe. So it's been around since the early 1900s.
Yeah, I'm sure that's kind of what I found. And on this podcast, we've gone out into some of those old buildings in Grand Island, just talking with the current proprietors. And I think that's one of the great things about your location, is that it has such a deep connection to the town, that, that it's been there for 100 years. And like, one of the things I wanted to talk about was like the history of that name, Prairie Pride Brewing. And, you have this pre-prohibition name and this kind of pre-prohibition building. Was that intended? Or?
It was a little that way. Look, again, like I said, when we were looking at, the microbrewery craze, most microbreweries would start in older buildings in the downtown areas that were downtrodden. They found out that breweries change neighborhoods. Most of the older microbreweries that started up were in bad neighborhoods, but then again, they brought in people, the neighborhood's starting to change. So again, microbreweries change neighborhoods. The way the Prairie Pride name came about was, we're in the middle of Nebraska, Prairie, and I knew the Hastings Brewing Company had a beer called Prairie Pride Beer back in the early 1900s. And so I just kind of stole that name from the old beer that was a pre-prohibition beer and thought it fit well with central Nebraska.
What makes a beer like that style? Like, what is the pre-prohibition beer?
The pre-prohibition beer, is more of a lager type beer. We are just coming out with actually the Prairie Pride original beer. We have that in recipe, and that's going to be coming out here in the next 3 or 4 weeks. We had a sample batch come out here a couple weeks ago, and it just went over great. It just tasted more like the old beer. It had very, very simple recipe, included corn.
Yeah.
Not as many hops, so not as bitter as most of the ales, but most people are starting to get in more of the tasteful beers with the hops now. But we felt that having an original lager that goes along with our name would be interesting. We got the recipe from actually the family of the head brewer 110 years ago at the Hastings Brewing Company. When we first started, the family sent us out the recipe for Prairie Pride beer to one of our other owners and our head brewer, Alex Briner. And Alex had to go back and see what the recipe was and see what type of hops, what type of grains they used at that time, and extrapolate it, and then come up with the exact recipe that it was 100 years ago.
Yeah, you mentioned like people getting into more refined tastes and things nowadays. I was doing some reading when we were coming up with the idea for this Prohibition podcast, and I found that like during the Prohibition era that came about, like one of the things that happened was, you had this huge rise in, people disregarding the law, obviously, but doing their own home brews.
Sure.
And they didn't necessarily know what they were doing. So you would have these batches that people would make that wouldn't be, that wouldn't be safe. They wouldn't taste good. They wouldn't end up being what, the person intended. So what originated like directly after Prohibition ended is this very steady, reliable, the American lager that is, like your today's like maybe Bud Light or Miller or Budweiser, that is that kind of, I won't say bland might not be the right word, but very reliable taste for a long time because of those uncertainties that arose from people's home brews.
Well, a lot of they even had big breweries before that, and again, once they had those big breweries, they were better at regulating their temperatures during fermentation process. You start doing the home brewing ones, and people were doing in their basements. They didn't have refrigeration, so the temperatures varied dramatically in some of their basements when things were fermenting. Sometimes it could be real hot. You get more esters and different things that give you a more sour taste and whatnot. So that's the problem, is that the home brewing back then, the environmental conditions weren't optimal. When Prohibition ended, again, the bigger brewing companies came back in with the better equipment that they can regulate the temperatures during fermentation, and that helped a lot.
Yeah, and one of the things I thought was funny was, some of those bigger companies, I think Pabst was one of them. I think Miller might have been another that sold that malt extract during Prohibition. Yep. Like they were still allowed to do that under the guise of, it's for bread making.
Correct.
But a lot of people took those instructions and were kind of like, okay, we're going to go ahead and make beer with this.
Right.
And that, that's what ultimately leads to that.
There was actually, I think there was two during Prohibition. A lot of the breweries would make near beer.
Yeah.
And actually there was two companies, I think one out of Buffalo, New York, and then the Getz Brewing Company out of St. Joe, Missouri, were the only ones that got bigger during Prohibition, because they could find their near beer, their whatever they used for their recipe, they just added grain alcohol to it, and it was essentially beer. So those are two companies that actually got bigger during Prohibition, using making near beer.
There was a lot of things that came as a result of Prohibition, just that we will live with on a daily basis. Like in the previous podcast that I talked to with Alex, we talked about how a lot of the beers are 4.3%, and that's because of a legacy with Prohibition. Are you aware of anything else that we kind of live with on a daily basis?
Well, we got federal income taxes because Prohibition.
There you go. Yeah,
because of Prohibition. We got organized crime because of Prohibition.
Yeah.
So those are two evils, I guess, if you want to look at it that way, that came about because of Prohibition. Before Prohibition, I don't believe there was any federal income tax. Everything was they tax alcohol, and they made quite a bit of money. And then again, obviously, the mafia and the organized crime. When something's made illegal, they were bootlegging it in from Canada down, and that's how Detroit and Chicago had big families of crime families, because they could bring it in from Canada and bootleg it.
Yeah, it's a rich tradition. I think it was just about everywhere. And like, I found a number of papers just in the Hall County area of people doing their own things and smuggling in alcohol and horse collars and every other, every other thing, because the regulation of behavior, I don't know, is ever.
Yeah. And they usually have
successful.
Some ties to the bigger cities. Like I know Omaha had ties to Chicago. The people that brought that in.
Well, we're sitting here in your office, for those of you who can't see this. And we are surrounded by just some of the best artifacts of, beer merchandise from the early 20th century, late 19th century that I've had the privilege of seeing. It's, it's signage, it's all sorts of, bottles and cups and glasses, and from some of the biggest names in Nebraska brewing is your collection. Do you have a favorite piece that's in your collection? Do you have several of them that stand out?
My favorite piece is probably just, I've been in Grand Island for 25 years, is that Grand Island Brewing Company lager beer metal sign. That was probably, again, from the early 1910s or something like that. I actually got that guy from a guy in Minnesota who had called me because he found out that I had been collecting. And he, in the early 70s, he lived in Cahoy, Nebraska. And he said in about 1974, he found that sign up in a grain building that I think was torn down 5 or 6 years ago in Cahoy, Nebraska. And he said he's had it ever since. So I just kind of like the way that he lived in Cahoy, Nebraska, found that sign in the 70s, took it to him. It's been living with him in Minnesota until about 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And then found its way back to Grand Island.
Well, that's great. I mean, that's where it belongs, clearly.
And it's hard to find metal signs anymore from that time because during World War II, there was the metal drive. So a lot of the metal signs from the early breweries were turned into bombs. So
yeah, absolutely. How do you go about collecting your items? You go to find them at different antique stores?
You know, it's more by word of mouth anymore that people know. Somebody says, well, I have something up in my attic from my grandmother that, and then sometimes it finds its way to me. Sometimes I do have friends that have been in the antique business for years and years and years, and then they'll see something in another state or something here or at an auction, and they'll give me a call. And so it's more by word of mouth. It's hard to find anything in antique stores anymore. Yeah,
there's a lot of Americana that you can get the items that are well known to everyone, right. But if you want those 1 in 1,000 right. pieces that every collection
they don't make them at Walmart anymore.
No. Speaking of just kind of like the rarity of these objects, I've never heard of a handful of these. What's the most? Is like Robin Hood beer? Is that from Nebraska?
Yeah, Robin Hood beer was out of Omaha. It was from the Fontenelle Brewing Company. Again, all of these have a life. That was on 2nd and Hickory Street in Omaha. Most people know Omaha. It's way on the east side of town, down by the river. There was a place called the Nebraska Brewing Company. That box behind you is the original one. And then it turned to Willow Springs Brewing Company. And then after Prohibition, it became the Fontenelle Brewing Company. And then it turned into the Metz Brewing Company, which maybe some of the old timers remember from the 50s and 60s.
Sure. Well, I mean, just in my own research, I know that there's been a lot of breweries, there's been a resurgence of the industry in the last 20 years in this country. I think there's something to the effect of 6,000 microbreweries now in the United States. And being from Lincoln, it wasn't ever a thing that I grew up seeing until Zipline Brewing came out just in the last 10 years. But we were kind of talking before the podcast about how that's kind of true of Lincoln uniquely in Nebraska.
Yeah, Lincoln was a dry county for a long, long time. And I don't think it was until even the 90s that they even started selling alcohol on Sundays.
Yeah, I don't think so. And even then, it was like certain hours because I worked at a few grocery stores as a younger person, and they were closed until midday at least on Sundays.
Or something, yeah.
We had some of your correspondence here that was from Antelope Brewing, which was the only brewery that was
in Lincoln,
and it was
that's the only one that I've ever heard of, and I just have a letterhead from that, and that's about the only thing that's ever been found from.
Yeah, from 1873 was this letterhead from Antelope Brewing, and by the mid 1880s, that place was already out of business.
Yeah.
And,
by the late 1880s, they went. Lancaster County went into Prohibition essentially themselves.
Yeah, and Nebraska went into Prohibition before the nation went into Prohibition. They go in
correct.
A few
we were
years
actually
early.
The last state to once the Congress got Nebraska, it was the 33rd or 34th state. That was the last state they needed to get their 2/3. To go to have the votes to go into national prohibition.
Yeah, that's just crazy to me. But well, this is a history podcast, so I wanted to kind of ask you as a last question if you have a favorite story of the Prohibition era. As a collector, is there something that you've come across that is particularly of interest to you?
Oh, not so much of any one particular story, but it is pretty interesting that. Again, you were talking about that earlier. There were 6,000 microbreweries now, or breweries in the United States, where before Prohibition, I think there was 4,500.
Oh, wow.
Even before 1919. So you can think about 100 years later, it took us that long to really reach the number of breweries we had from the pre-prohibition area, because every little city, again, we're in Nebraska, and again, you can look at some of my signs. We got ones from Nebraska City, Odo Brewing Company, Fremont Brewing Company, West Point Brewing Company, Columbus had a brewing company, Fremont, Hastings, Grand Island. Every little city had a brewing company. Every little city had a bar and a church.
Yeah.
And you had to have these little brewing companies because there was no refrigeration. So they only had a certain radius that they can go with their beer on ice.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
That's why you had to have them all over the place. But that's why I thought that's one thing that is, there were just a ton of pre-prohibition little breweries back then. And now we just, in the last 5 years, I think eclipsed the number of breweries that there were before Prohibition.
I didn't know that. That's crazy. That this small area, seemingly now when you talk about it, this era of 13 years, 1920 to 33, it's like almost like a snap of the fingers it was passed. But I mean, that decimated the industry for 100 years that, that it took.
Well, and then it changed, because then you got the big macros, you got the Anheuser-Busch's, and essentially they would come into a market like Omaha, where Stuhr's was a big regional beer, and they would just undercut their prices to the point in time where Stuhr's couldn't function anymore and had to close its factory. And Stuhr's was a huge brewery for the 40s, 50s, and 60s, the years after Prohibition. But some of the bigger ones came in, and like I said, they could take a loss in the Omaha market for a while until the other brewery around there went bankrupt. And then we only had a handful of breweries in the whole country.
Yeah. I mean, we're sitting in this room, and there's plenty of these breweries that I know, if Prohibition wasn't enough, coming up against some of those huge corporations certainly killed them. I mean, I'm looking at the Fremont Brewing Company behind me that I know held on until 1934, but just coming back from Prohibition, they weren't able to hold on. And I mean, I'm sure there's several that I'm not even seeing right now that have similar stories to tell that barely survived. But
a few came back after. Fremont came back a couple of years. Columbus came back a couple of years. Grand Island had one. Was they got shut down during Prohibition for having false bottoms in their vats. They were making real beer.
Oh, sure. So why not?
So the state came in and shut them down, and they never recovered after that.
That's okay with me, honestly. I don't encourage breaking the law, but in this instance, I think everyone was willing to look the other way, and we, as a country, went the other way eventually. So, well, Dr. Phil Cahoy, that's all the questions that I had for you. I just wanted to thank you for being on the podcast.
No problem, anytime.
That is going to do it for this episode 2 of the Prohibition podcast series. We are going to jump ahead next week onto a completely different topic, and we are going to be tackling the Barton-Back Opera House here in Grand Island, but also opera houses in general.
I'm really interested in this conversation because I've known the Barton-Back Opera House has been was a thing in Grand Island for years and years and years, but I just don't know that much about it. So I'm going to be coming to this with very little knowledge, which is my standing most of the time, but this one in particular.
Yeah, we have a lot of great episodes coming this season yet, so stick with us, and we'll be back next week with a new episode.